Hi, everybody. I'm Kat. I'm a psychologist for software teams, and we decided to make another video because people liked the first one. So joining me today are John Flourney, who's a principal research scientist in the Developer Success Lab, and we are so excited to talk to Kristen Foster-Marks. I'll let the two of you introduce yourselves.
All right, yeah. I am John Flournoy. I'm a principal research scientist in the Developer Success Lab, PhD in psychology, formerly studying adolescent brains with fMRI.
Nice.
So
And
cool.
sometimes John calls himself a reformed fMRI practitioner
Absolutely.
or something like that.
We can have a whole episode on fMRI if you want.
Okay, we'll see.
John also calls himself a methods head, which I love.
Yes,
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good one.
yeah.
thank you.
Cool. Well, hi everyone.
Kristen?
I'm Kristen Foster-Marks. I'm the head of developer experience at Depot, and I'm a developer success lab alumna, which is just a badge of honor that I wear. I
I
miss.
love that.
Yeah,
Absolutely true. We
yeah.
should have like a reunion.
We should still have a reunion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Developer Success Lab is the place where we all kind of met, although John and I have been trading back and forth jokes and criticisms of science, I think, for a long time on social media. And as I recall it, the goal of this call for us is just to get together and jam on some research ideas. This was a thing that we all loved doing a lot in the lab, and Kristen had this lovely idea of not losing that, even though she's in this exalted, amazing head of DevEx role now. Science breaks down barriers, I guess, and so we're going to continue that tradition. So we thought we would do some thinking out loud in this call together, like real thinking together, and sort of model how we like to try to turn ideas into studies in the lab. Does that sound right to you too?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. I miss doing this so much.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it was a good tradition. And feel free to like keep harassing us over email with your research ideas.
I
So I'm
will not
excited to
hesitate.
be part of that.
and you're still contributing to our magazine, our online journal. So yeah,
Yes.
we have a lot
Yes,
of points of connection still.
Yeah,
It's
that's
great.
absolutely.
It's
right. Yeah.
wonderful.
The
Yeah.
Developer Success Lab gets this little clause in people, and then it's
Yeah.
like, I'm sorry, you can't.
Yeah. For me, it's like going through a PhD program. Like you two are my professors. Carol Lee's my professor. Yeah, like
I'm not going to let this asymmetry continue because Kristen is a really important co-author, brings us software developer expertise, which is very essential to the way we work. We try to work with community-based methods, and you're an expert in your field. So I know you love to say that, but like professor right back.
Absolutely.
Hmm. So, Kristen, do you want to kick us off with some of your ideas?
well, I just so happen to have. This is the short list. I think we put this on the calendar maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I have to tell you both, my dog walks, which is about 3 dog walks a day. I have an Australian Shepherd. Like this is what I've been doing on my dog walks. Like, oh, we should talk about this, and oh, I should run this idea by them. And I decided to just write down like 5 or 6 of these. We won't get to all of them. But maybe just for the audience, it might be worth just letting folks know, like the way that we used to do this was we would come to our research jam. Sometimes we would have one idea that we would talk through. Sometimes everybody would have an idea, and we basically would just kind of try to poke holes in it or talk about why it was worth doing. And we'd oftentimes get into like how we would do it, and we'd talk about ethical concerns with doing it. So I'm excited to just kind of hear your unfiltered thoughts on how viable and useful these ideas might be.
Yeah. And what was it like for you, Kristen? Like you had joined our lab, you had never been part of a scientific process. I think for us it was very, normal, like very typical that we would sit around and sort of vet ideas this way. Was it surprising to you or
It was just delightful. The I have a master's degree, and as part of that master's degree, and I won't get too much into this, but I had a project that I was so passionate about that I wanted to do my thesis on. And
Mhm.
that thesis project was approved by my advisor. And it kind of ended up falling apart in a way. I didn't actually get the mentorship and the feedback on it that I wanted. And so being able to do this sort of research jam with all of you was almost like getting to do that master's thesis over, at least the first part of it over.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
that's
I
so
mean,
great.
both know me, like with writing, with research, with anything, it's such a communal process. It shouldn't be done alone. One person's never going to have the full depth of expertise
Mm,
or all of the background knowledge that you might need to properly evaluate something. And so this was always just really exciting for me.
mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Thanks for
awesome.
that.
And it's not unlike how I've seen science play out in the academy too. There's a lot of collaboration and exchange of ideas like through this process. So
Yeah.
In the best versions.
yeah, in the best versions.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So, something that's been on my mind a lot. You both know that developer experience is on everyone's minds. And there is empirical research that has looked at developer experience back in 2012. You know, it was introduced as an academic construct. And since then, there's been a series of what I might call like the big developer experience papers. Um, I don't think that the demographics reporting on some of those papers is great. And I
Uh-huh.
think that what something I would love to see as somebody who is innately interested in this space and also somebody who is, like professionally employed in this space too, I would like to see some differentiation between different demographics. And so let me give an example. I
Mm,
do not believe that the developer experience or what makes a good or bad developer experience for an entry level software developer is the same as a principal or a staff software
mm.
developer. But there is no research to my knowledge that explores this.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's super interesting.
Okay.
Heterogeneity is a big thing that a lot of psychologists are talking about right
Science
now.
jargon alert already time. We said we
Heterogeneity.
were going to call John on. You have to define it now.
Uh, the effects, just what Kristen was saying, the effects might be different for different groups of people or different individuals, and we
And
often,
different groups of people in different situations.
yeah. So
So
all
let's
sorts of,
even complicate it more. Yeah.
and you can complicate it even more beyond that. But the idea is often we just take a group average, we'd run an intervention, assume it works the same for everybody, kind of. Um, yeah. So digging into those differences is
Yeah.
crucial.
Digging into those differences is crucial. A whole bunch of different scientific directions pop into my mind here. One is, do we know the landscape? Do we know what is happening across all kinds of important groups that might be our focus? And we can talk a lot about what those groups should be, but like a reasonable starting place is what are things that seem to really change the day to day of people at work. One thing is experience or seniority. Another thing might be large identity characteristics that we know really change how people get treated at scale. So, like, that's very important to know. Um, and there's a question in my mind, which is just, do we know enough about these different groups? And there's all kinds of systemic effects that mean our samples in research aren't always representative of everyone in the world. So I think this is extremely true of a lot of software research. I've been really vocal about that, Kristen. And I think that it's not true that no one has ever looked at, what are junior developers feeling or what are senior developers feeling. There are studies that kind of dive into those experiences, but I agree that there's not always a sense of what's the standard and should we hold ourselves to a standard of, at least acknowledging who we're looking at. And I encounter this sort of feeling that people want findings that apply to all developers and that are just like the developer and the developer experience. And as soon as you start working in this work, right, Kristen, you're thinking, what's a developer really? And who are they? A second thing that comes to my mind is the field is changing. The field is changing all the time. So, yes, maybe somebody wrote a paper back 25 years ago about what developer experience was like then, but who developers are is different. The economy's shifted, the cross-cultural context has shifted. There's a lot of gaps in our knowledge there. And then what John brought up in the first point here, the heterogeneity of both, what's happening for people, of the way different effects might create different outcomes. There's a lot of complexity. So something I'm thinking about is there's a really great intervention in education that was trying to motivate students to change their behavior and try to reconcile faster rather than like escalate conflict with their classmates, right? So kids were getting into a lot of fights basically in schools. They found that they needed to intervene on the teachers and the disciplinary attitudes that the teachers had. And then the students could actually lean into and take advantage of the kind of, socio-emotional learning that they were giving them. So it's not that there wasn't an effect of the socio-emotional learning for the students, but there was this big, messy situation where, depending on whether or not you were at a school that had like very socio-emotionally informed teachers or not, that was kind of blocking your access to the benefits of that intervention. So I would often, when I see claims about developer experience, I ask myself, what are preconditions to getting this effect that we're talking about? And as you know, Kristen, I wrote this paper about psychological affordances.
I was just about to bring it up. Yep.
So that's long-winded, but that's kind of like my immediate, this is a very philosophical one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd like, Kat, do you think that there is an analogy between the research that you just mentioned with the kids and their teachers playing that important role in, these students being able to mediate this conflict, and engineering leaders mediating the developer
Yeah.
experience
I mean,
of a junior developer, let's say?
I don't want to be put out a story that sounds patronizing, right? Because these are adults. We're not talking about I'm only talking about, education because that has actually been an area where we've invested a lot of work into intervention. So we have a lot of good evidence. But I want to make this point straight off the bat, like you don't want to take like a condescending, like developers are not children, However, the large point of psychology in so many of the emerging fields that look at interventions is, yeah, this is very multi-systems. So, we have the effect and what an individual can do, and then we also have this larger context. And don't kid yourself, there are people in that context that have the power to set certain kinds of messages. And then those messages have effects. And it's not like we're robots, who can't make choices. However, I think that the lever points, the kind of power that people have who actually do set messages inside of their organization, like that needs to be taken really seriously. The whole thing is not just a individual developer story.
We're sort of embarking on one of these subgroups that you might be thinking of, Christian, right now in a qualitative study looking at people who build infrastructure and deal with incidents. And that, I think, is going to be an awesome project that's going to open up the ways in which these people who are doing this kind of work have different experiences that might be unique and might need some unique interventions. But I'm curious now, like Kristen, what's on your mind in terms of where you would like to see this research go in terms of breaking out some of the differences?
Yeah. And I want to loop back to this research that you all are starting to do, because I have some thoughts on that.
Mm.
And this is how research jams go, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm deeply concerned with the state of the industry for the junior developer in particular, because
Hmm.
we are seeing less hiring. And for many years now, we've been seeing less hiring of entry level talent. And then you
Yeah.
add all of the remote work that we've started to do after the pandemic. I think that it's a really shitty time to be an entry level software engineer.
Yeah.
And I'm worried about what that experience is like for them because I went through the process of learning how to code and being an entry level practitioner back in 2017. So not
Yeah.
too long ago. And y'all, it was stinking hard. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And it's great. Like it worked out. It was fun. And I got the thing done. But there are so many things I think that get in the way of folks being able to like move past that entry level skill and knowledge level and designation. And that's fuzzy. We could have a whole other conversation about that, of course. Um, and I just really feel for folks who are trying to make the same transition that I did back then, now, whether they're coming straight out of college, their university programs, or if they're self-taught and they're entering the workforce for the first time, or if they're going through a boot camp or a technical training program for second career folks. And I know we've always been interested in what are the practical applications
Mhm.
Mhm.
of the research that we're doing, right? Who does this stand to help, and how do we help the research help them?
Yeah.
So I just would love to see research done that focuses on that demographic so that we
Mhm.
can help them and maybe
Mhm.
even do some enablement with the leadership, with ICs, who are the teammates of these people.
Mhm.
Remove some of those things that make getting into this field really difficult from their context or assuage those in a way so
Yeah.
that we can help these people persist. Because it's a hard field to persist in. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I've always thought there's, you know, endless stuff that's like get the kids to code, get the girls to code, get every I make no secret that I don't like to sit on panels for that stuff because I'm really interested in fixing the leaky pipeline rather than pouring more into the pipe kind of stuff.
Yes.
And there's a somewhat controversial paper. YouTube doesn't let me link things in the show notes yet because I don't think we have enough cred, but I'll link it. There's a somewhat controversial paper that's just about it's like called the I frame and the S frame, and it's set from behavioral economics point of view, and it says, we love to give individual explanations, and we've got to work on structural solutions. And you're making some really beautiful structural points, Kristen, like a lot of stuff that is necessary to have this field be healthy, like having a healthy career pipeline and a generous one and one that's inclusive, because we know it's hard to get people to persist in this work. We know a lot of people drop out. So we really do need to be concerned with this and not act like senior technical people are some kind of infinite resource, actually. So I share that. I'm thinking, John, about things that are actual research here. So
Yeah.
we saw some effects for junior people in our research, didn't we? Would you
Yeah. Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. If I remember correctly, I think we saw that junior researchers especially benefited from our community of practice intervention.
Junior
Um,
technologists, yeah. I
yeah,
think
yeah, sorry. Thank
junior
you, junior
researchers are
technologists.
probably in trouble as well, but
Yep, yep. Putting on my old hat. Yeah, and so this is actually a group of people who are already super motivated to learn. They've signed up for our study on the skills platform, and they then get or don't get an intervention in which they are reminded that one of the ways that they can overcome obstacles is to think about and maybe even reach out, whatever they choose to do, with their community of practice, whether that's inside or outside their organization. And we did see a benefit for junior developers, especially in a way that kind of does suggest that, yeah, Kristen, maybe they are struggling, and that little reminder could be a little helpful. There's a lot more to explore there. That could maybe be another thing we jam on. But how do you actually intervene and make that community of practice an actual support network? Um,
yeah. It was very cool to see that just so we sort of had them come and we recreated the challenge of learning basically in our experiment. So we'll release more on this. Maybe it's not quite public yet, but we had people do a digital intervention, where they came in and they remembered they had a learning goal and then they imagined being challenged and like giving up on the goal basically. And then the people who got our community of practice intervention showed better outcomes, like showed higher self-efficacy. We were essentially able to protect the decay of learning that naturally happens over time. We were able to mitigate that.
Oh,
So, that's a scientific, like in the lab, sort of like a sandbox demonstration of this, but it's wonderful to have evidence about it because you can use that evidence to, take it to your boss and say, a community of practice really matters. It matters that our engineers, it matters to our work outcomes that our engineers have community. Do we have that? Or you might be thinking, we need to change our workforce and we need to write things in a different language or use a new framework. Like this kind of evidence shows us that it's the social part of this is very central to the technical work.
Mm.
And I
yeah.
think this is really true for software. You know this, Kristen, so well. We've talked so much about learning. Like software work breaks down barriers because you have to like go find your community in this language or in this framework or whatever, or share knowledge. And that's like the innovation economy, is requiring that of people. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think in times of more austerity, like a lot of the investment in learning time for developers, it's just seen as a luxury, and not seen as an important process in innovation.
Yeah.
So, side note, this is kind of one of the reasons we like to make our research products and these kinds of conversations public is because the research itself is potentially a kind of intervention. It's not as direct as
True.
others, but we have evidence that you can take to your manager. Maybe we can design an intervention to help you do that in the future. But yeah, it's really cool to see research work like that. I don't know if I've ever seen that in my field, so this is amazing.
That's like the aspiration that we have for Dev Success Lab projects. And like Kristen is an author of our toolkit that we
Yeah,
made. So like there's the specific content of the toolkit, like Kristen created this learnathon, that people can
that's right.
use, and that might drive up learning culture on a team. Like
Yeah.
that's itself an intervention material. And
Yep.
boy, I'd love to do a project just assessing the impact of that. We had a study where we looked at the impact of a hackathon and
Yeah.
how, yes, you could think of a hackathon. This was Carol Lee's great idea. Like you could think of a hackathon having output for a company in terms of a product idea, and
Hmm.
but there are really important psychological benefits. So she wanted to measure stuff like, can people imagine themselves taking on a new technical role? And a hackathon can give you sort of this psychologically safe place to essentially step out of your day job and imagine yourself being something that you weren't before. And we saw that and we documented it. And there was, if you had a good hackathon team culture, people came out of it thinking, yeah, I might actually try this in real life of my job. So that's like that's exactly what people want to happen in their companies, around employee upskilling. Um,
Yes. Yes. And that reminds me, and I don't want this to come off like, we've got an advertisement for Pluralsight here, but I used to run technical upskilling.
it is where we've all been, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Listen, we all work at or worked at Pluralsight. And this was actually before my time joining the technical upskilling team. But there was they called it an academy, and it was a DevOps academy. And it was meant for anybody internally at the company who wanted to transition into a DevOps role.
Mm,
So the overall purpose of the program was that, hey, by the time you're done with this, we want you to fill one of our open DevOps roles.
mm,
Annabelle Thomas Taylor is one of my favorite people in this world. She's just a wonderful person and a really kick-ass software engineer. She went through that program. She became a DevOps engineer at Pluralsight. She's now a platform engineer at another company that the name is escaping me. But
mm.
I just talked to her recently to bring this back to your all's incident research. incidents research.
Yay.
And it's connected to learning. I asked her recently if she felt like, as a platform engineer and a DevOps engineer, if it would be worthwhile for non-platform engineers, so just like your like regular, I don't know how to distinguish this. Your regular software engineers, not on the platform team, not on the infrastructure team, not DevOps.
Yeah.
Would it be worthwhile for them to, in some communal way, learn about the software that allows them to troubleshoot bugs and system failures? So, for example, there's a project called Datadog. You've probably heard of it. It gives you a view into your systems and where they're failing. That's a really kind of vague, general way to describe it. It's a sort of observability software. And I always felt like, as a software engineer, I wish that I would have had some dedicated time with my peers to like learn how to use that software, because it was enormous in scope and functionality. The only time I was ever in there was when I was troubleshooting a bug or a failure, and so my anxiety was high.
You were stressed.
Yeah. And we've talked about this actually before we hit the record button, just the way that anxiety can be really deleterious for actual learning, uptake, and acquisition.
Yeah.
So for years now, I've held this belief that, these kinds of systems that we're generally in when we are very stressed, that we should have some sort of dedicated, organized upskilling, preferably communally, so that everybody kind of has the same knowledge about it, speaks the same language. And Annabelle, who I trust more than myself on this, she said, you know what? I don't think so. I think that the kinds of bugs you run into, the kinds of system failures that we see are so different from one case to another, because when one of them happens, we fix it so that that kind of thing doesn't happen again, right?
Okay.
So just-in-time learning is probably more effective, more efficient for this type of upskilling.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's a hypothesis. It's a testable hypothesis in a lot of ways. I hear a number of things from the point of view of learning science that make me think about, research ideas here. Like, one thing is we have a sort of concept of ecological validity and the need that people have for domain-specific learning. So we've all sat through trainings where we're like, this isn't gonna do anything and it's a waste of time, right? Like, we all have been victims, I think, to, oh my gosh, learning sounds like a good thing, but actually this making a good course, this, Kristen, as a teacher, making a good course is really hard.
Wait, are you guys going through your annual compliance training? Is that
no comment. But like, there's many dimensions to this, and that's why it's not a simple who's right or who's wrong, because there's several questions that come to my mind. One research question is like, how could we make training as good as possible? So that's a whole question, like, can we come up with better sorts of training? Are there ways to, because you're accurate that there are benefits to actually having a safe preparation zone, essentially. And this is like, you think about people who do crisis response, first responders, they're not like, oh, we're going to have you do CPR for the first time when someone does it in front of you. Because, people choking has a lot of, it's true that like actually responding in an emergency is different from your training, but it's not true that your training does nothing, actually. So there's some balance there. I also think, though, there's a really interesting question about what do we do with the fact that we do have incidents we can't ever plan for or predict? So how do we make sure that people going through that can do it as best they can in the moment and then maybe get repair afterwards? So I would almost like locate our research questions in three different areas: pre-incident, inside the incident, and after the incident. And for each one of those, I might start thinking about different parts of the psychological experience that we could help with. And then I think there's a fourth question buried in what you said, which is like, can we get all these people outside of these roles to actually care about this work and what's happening there? And there's questions there about, can we increase their awareness? Could we increase their empathy? Could
Mm.
we increase their involvement? I think all of those are slightly different research questions. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I'm going to ask some questions that'll probably sound very naive to the software developers and engineers here. Um, so I'm imagining you're talking about engineers who are using this debugging software every once in a while when something goes wrong. But this is something that's maybe more regularly used by the DevOps folks.
Potentially, yes.
Potentially.
My experience as a software engineer, that has how it's been.
Right. And
Yep.
so you're one of the things is like overcoming just gaining general familiarity, maybe in a communal setting where you can actually like everybody can feel comfortable with the fact that maybe they don't know everything about this. And that will just maybe reduce anxiety in the moment to whatever extent not being familiar with the software contributes to that. Maybe there's nothing specific technical, like specifically technical that is helpful about that training, but it's a anxiety reduction technique basically.
Mm.
Um, so that totally makes sense to me. It's interesting that yeah, that you might not gain specific technical skills, but the way my where my mind went to is like seeing the potential complexity of that software and maybe even dealing with the variety of like fake incidents to just that would seem to me to be a really interesting way to test whether that builds empathy for um,
Mm.
the DevOps and platform folks. And
Yeah,
just build community there, especially if they're involved in that training. Yeah, anyways.
sorry,
Interesting.
I have three little brothers, and so I'm always interrupting people because that's
Yeah,
how
oh, please.
we would always jam. I actually have a
We're being more
specific,
polite than usual right now. Sorry to
we're
over.
trying to,
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
We're on
I
camera.
normally John and I are just hacking at it, but I have a really specific research idea to throw out there for y'all. There is, and you probably familiar with this, John, from the anxiety well-being side, right? Um there's such an interesting thing that happens in how you interpret what you're experiencing.
Hmm.
And that is frequently a tool. We have a lot of empirical evidence that this is a tool that can really help people who are experiencing like the deep physiological experiences of stress and anxiety. So, you know, sweaty palms, heart racing, breathing, all that stuff like that triggered in specific events, like you're taking a test is one, but you're solving a bug at work and, that's another one. And, we've put out work on code review anxiety and I'm thinking about those models. So these are like big, big, big organizational dynamics we might want to be trying to fix. But in the meantime, when I think about what's a really actionable thing that could help you, one person, maybe a junior engineer right now, it might be some training on this kind of thing because we see benefit if you can learn to bring some mindfulness to that moment, if you can learn and practice some self-compassion skills before that moment, we see that people can appraise their own experience in a much more positive way. So instead of being flooded with all of the thoughts that are like, I'm a stupid engineer, I don't know enough, oh my gosh, I should have learned Datadog and I didn't, I'm an idiot, they're gonna fire me. All of these are like thoughts that I've had in anxious, that kind of thought in an anxious
Yeah.
moment. Those
Yeah,
thoughts
absolutely.
flood through you, they take away your resources. And that's because we're trying to survive in that moment.
Yep.
So, we have all these interesting techniques in psychology to help people say, yes, this is a scary moment, but I've already practiced, and maybe I'll have the bad thoughts, but I've already practiced thinking, I am a good engineer. Other people support me. I have people to call on. I'm actually rising to the challenge. And we see a big difference in the empirical literature for people who say, I praise this as challenge that I'm going to meet.
Hmm.
Like athletes take this stance a lot. They feel
Mm.
heart pounding, they feel palms sweaty, and then they're not like I'm crashing and burning. What they think is I'm about to be a rock star.
Yeah. It helps them. It doesn't hinder them. It
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
in engineering, there are so many cultures of being so hard on yourself. And I think it's really breaks my heart sometimes.
Yeah.
Those
So that's
situations,
something I'm interested in. Yeah.
yeah, those situations crippled me as a software engineer. And I know I'm not the only one. There is a principal software engineer on at the company that I now work at. And
Mm.
yesterday in stand up, he so casually, y'all. Like I couldn't believe how casually. I was just so it was a great learning moment for me. Mentioned that he'd made a change. And then like an hour later, he noticed some weird stuff and he panic reverted the change that he made because he thought, "Ooh, the timing is right. Like this was probably caused by the change I made." And then he went and he troubleshot it and he fixed it and everything was great. And he reported all this in stand up just like it wasn't a big deal.
Mm.
And again, it was just it was good modeling for someone like me who does get crippled by that stuff.
Mm.
There's
Hmm.
no reason to get crippled by it. Like principal engineers make these kinds
Yeah.
of mistakes,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
you can revert your change, and you can even admit to folks that you panic reverted the change, and it's okay. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
what the job is. It's just
That's
what,
interesting.
yeah,
Because that's also an instance where your reappraisal skills are now bolstered by that example,
yeah,
which makes it back to being communal and
Yeah.
systemic.
social
But
learning.
you can start with building a community, hopefully one
Yeah.
person at a
Yeah,
time.
I mean, I'm really interested in social cognition, what we call social cognition. And a lot of times in software, people hear the word social and they think it means parties or that you love to talk to people. And we could have a whole different conversation about how those stereotypes are hard for people who actually do like parties and who are in software. But I just like to say it means something really bigger. It means, we live in this world where we think not just about ourselves, but we think about what other people think, and we think about what's expected of us as a software engineer, and we think about, the norms around us, and that's very natural, and it can be a route to really good things or really hard things. And I guess a research question that comes up to my mind is like, you could be lucky to be in a place that has someone who personally puts themselves out there and models this, but how do we help more places get to that? Like, it shouldn't just depend on one person who has the seniority and the power always stepping up. And like, we've probably also experienced being at places where that's not the culture. So I'm really interested in how do we motivate people to move towards that culture if they're not in it yet, And
Yeah.
how do we maybe kind of repair the damage from the opposite model? So I don't have answers to that, but that's like a big research, exciting idea for me. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Um, I know that we're coming up on time here.
Mm.
I'm still so curious about the research y'all are doing around incidents. Do we have 5 more minutes to
Yeah, let's jam for five
like a
minutes
super
on.
fast jam?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'd love to get your input on it.
Yeah. John, do you want to lead the
Yeah, I'll do my best job and you can fill in what I miss. Uh, this actually came out of a research jam session with Dr. Carol Lee, who is not with us right this moment. She'll be back soon. But she was really interested in just the different experience of stress that security professionals. We started with security professionals
Yeah.
that they might experience. This sort of very general idea being, here are a group of folks who are responding when things go wrong, and whose work might be relatively invisible when things are going right. Um, and we've expanded to start thinking about people who build infrastructure more generally and incidents more generally. So the kind of incident that
Yeah.
was narrowly avoided, Kristen, in your story. Um,
Yeah.
and I think, generally felt like we didn't know enough necessarily to design a kind of survey method or intervention or some kind of very quantitative data collection um, study. Um,
There's a lot going on in under these topics, to put it lightly. There's like a lot
yeah,
of different directions we could go. So we
Yeah.
wanted to take a different approach to designing it that was very communal and where we sort of could aggregate themes from the community and think about the unique impact our lab could have. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's yeah, this is qualitative work, but it's systematic. So I think we're going to do this in a systematized way. But our first step was, which I think is super interesting and cool, is to meet with some people who have a lot of lived experience, and we're going to do some research jamming with those folks.
Yeah.
Um, and that's an open call that we've had out now. And this is the
Yeah.
first time I've done this kind of research, and it's super exciting because in terms of just a methodological psychology thing, like we make a questionnaire up often based on like what we think might be reasonable. Then we do some psychometric testing on that number stat stuff, and it's like, okay, it's reliable and valid because it correlates with this other thing. But this is like a moment that we get to go in and say, what is an incident? First of all, how do you understand what an incident is? And one of the things you brought up yesterday, Kat, just some different psychological constructs that we might ask people, like, what's your experience of this moment like? Does it fit into our preconceived notions of this thing or that thing?
Yeah, yeah. I've obviously spent a lot of time with software practitioners, and I'm really could I just say like really grateful for what people share with me. It's extraordinary in my opinion, like how much people want to tell their stories, and I don't take that lightly. And it's like a reason I'm in this field. And like as I hear people discuss being the person at the center of the storm, or whatever with an incident, I hear so many things that we've discussed in psychology, but we haven't brought to this context,
Mm.
So experiencing, feeling like dehumanized, like you are just treated like a machine, like the only thing people value about you are your technical skills. And that is we've actually studied stuff about this in psychology. And that is the sort of thing that's really interesting with engineers because it feels kind of like good for a while, or it can feel like, well, great, like I am my skills, we're all really technical and we care deeply about being really technical. But then the problem is if you have a human need that makes you not a machine, you can feel like I don't get to have that, and other people don't want me to have that. And so it is actually really hard for people. So I'm interested in all kinds of things here, like both bringing some of this psychology wisdom to software teams, but also I think it's very important that psychology goes into some of these worlds because we haven't. We often study firefighters, healthcare people. There's so few psychologists working with software teams. And if you do work with software teams, it tends to be something like about huge, well-resourced tech companies. It doesn't tend to be like these very difficult experiences. So
Honestly, a
instead
ton
of
of the
baby
evidence is just
steps,
from undergrads too. Sorry.
yeah, right. Yeah. Different research jam is John and I just criticizing psychology, but so I'm,
So interesting.
yeah.
Do we have time for two follow-up questions?
Yeah,
Um,
or ideas from your end, like
yeah.
what are we
Yeah.
missing? We're thinking
What do
about
you want us to do?
yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Okay, so a question that I would love answered, if it were answered, partly answered through this research, that would be awesome. But one of my other questions is like, what are the actual research questions, or have you gotten to that stage yet? But
We haven't
my
committed to those
big,
yet. Yeah.
okay, my big reaction right here is I'm thinking about a time that my husband had a flight booked for a Friday, and he decided a couple days before to move his flight to the day after, to a Saturday. And he came to me on Friday, a couple hours before his flight would have taken off. And he said, Kristen, the trains at Denver International Airport are broken. They're down. They're not
Mm,
working. Like, and they weren't working for hours. He would have missed this flight. And both of us just had such a deep level of empathy for the engineers who were responsible for fixing those
yeah.
trains. Like, can you
Your mind
imagine
went there right away. Yeah.
thousands of people missing their flights, and you
Yeah.
are the engineer on the team that is trying to fix these trains? And
Yes.
so now every time something stressful happens for either one of us at work, our go-to line is, well, it's not, fixing the trains at DIA at Denver Airport.
That's helpful
Amazing.
but it's not helpful for our train engineers who are listening to this.
Listen, so much
You're like,
respect.
wait, that is me.
Yeah. But I have that same level of empathy for our security engineers
Oh,
because if your company or your organization has a dedicated security team or role, there's a good reason for it. It's because it's really needed.
yeah,
And so when there is an incident that comes up that you or your team are responsible for taking care of, that's a high stress situation. And, in some industries more than others,
yeah,
possibly. But one thing I wonder about, I'm a risk averse person. There are certain software engineering roles I will never take because I never want to. I don't want to be in that position. Like I mentioned other or previously, like that kind of stuff kind of cripples me. I would crumble under that pressure. That's just something I know about myself. I would be curious to know if there's a certain type of engineer person who self-selects into those types of roles, if they kind of know what they're probably in for in terms of day-to-day stress and having to respond to incidents.
yeah,
Um,
Yeah,
and yeah,
that
that's
this
it.
came
yeah,
up yesterday.
Oh, okay.
yeah,
This
Yeah.
is
totally. It's kind of an obvious question, and we also have I'm always a little wary because we have the ability to form stereotypes so quickly.
Yep.
And I think those stereotypes can do a world of harm. So,
Yep.
but however, every job has selection pressures that happen. Like every pathway, and the further you get and the more specialized you get, you think about all the choices that stack up, and who has a greater likelihood of making those choices. And, but it's very multivariate probably. So I always hesitate to say because I think we gatekeep this kind of work as well so hard. I think a lot of people have, potential that's unseen. And I don't want to say this kind of person is the kind of person who can do this because I also think that hurts people in this work because then they like really identify. My brother worked in a hospital and like you really identify as a person who can work in a hospital and a person who can work in an emergency room.
Mhm.
And then a lot of times people have to leave. They have a limit on how much they can be running day-to-day trauma work. And then they have to go through this process of saying, okay, who am I if I'm not a person who's running in a... So
Yep.
John knows this. I'm very like social constructivist, but I think it's worth asking. There are many points, intervention points. One of the intervention points might be, can we make it easier so that you don't have to be this total in this superhuman zone to do this work? Because that's too much for anybody.
Yes. Yes.
What can we do knowing that things will fail and thing outages will happen? And I mean, this is the perspective of resilience engineering a lot of the time, right? And like this idea that we are building such that, we have to deal with this reality in the world and it can't keep relying on like heroing, no matter how good the
Mhm.
hero is. However, I also like think it's pretty interesting to ask like, who are you if you've made it this far? Who are, and that's like a super valid question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing that came up yesterday was we're guessing exactly what you said, Kristen, that folks may have higher distress tolerance. Again, open empirical question. This is a stereotype that I have, probably of folks who work in these areas. Also, it's just what we do to. It's a form of emotion regulation to select the
True.
situations that we feel that we can handle. And if there's a premium paid for being able to handle a certain kind of situation, you might say, I can handle that, and you go in that
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah.
And then there might be potentially, let's just imagine like a reinforcement there where now you have to be really good at distress tolerance. So you practice that and you practice that and you maybe build that muscle to the extent that you can, but that might not play out so well in across the rest of the areas of your life. There's this
Mm,
idea of over tolerance of distress. You might tolerate situations that could be fixable in other areas of your life that then
right.
you don't fix because you're
But you're used to
tolerant.
living on the edge and you're kind
Yeah.
of like, I guess I
So
just have to live on the edge all the time, even when you actually don't. And like, we can't blame ourselves for cultivating that so we
yeah.
all cultivate certain perspectives that way.
So I
Yeah.
think that's a really interesting way in which we can think of those selection pressures as, like Kat said, ways that we can make things easier
Yeah.
for people and open up the space, and
Yeah.
also ways in which people, I mean, maybe they're building really good muscles that have no downsides ever, but that's unlikely. So we want
Yeah.
to think of all of these things. Intense situation, what are the consequences of that
Yeah.
intensity?
I do think in our society, we generally have, we don't, we don't reward teachers enough. We don't, right? Like, there's all these kinds of things where we have valuable work we don't reward. But we do have at least like the storybook you tell your kid about what a doctor is, what a firefighter is. We have a cultural vocabulary around the fact that some people do hard work and scary work. And I think that software has its versions of this, but it's just really poignant to me that people in software who do that work feel like very unseen.
Mm,
I don't
Mhm.
think it's exactly the same, because I'm like, but I do think it is really worth saying that brings loneliness, and sometimes it doesn't matter how much money you get paid, it's still hard for you, because there's other needs you have. And
Yeah.
that is a conversation I think we haven't had enough, and I'm interested to push that forward.
Well, this research sounds really exciting. I think it has a huge potential to impact the field and to have
Mm,
a positive impact for the folks in it. And this actually, if I can bring this back full circle, I think
okay.
that part of what we're talking about here is beliefs, the beliefs that people hold. And we know and we believe that science and research has the ability to change people's beliefs.
Yeah.
That master's thesis project that I wanted to do was around beliefs about language learning,
mm,
Mm,
specifically how kind of mythologies, those erroneous beliefs, I'm going to call them erroneous beliefs, bear with me, how they have the potential to hinder the language acquisition process.
yeah.
If I
that's
believe
interesting.
that the best way to learn a foreign language is to sit down with a book in that language and translate it into English. We know through science that that's not a super effective way to learn a language for, let's say, like communicative purposes, right? Like, I'm not going to do that. I might be successful at that task, but that's not going to allow me to go live in a country where that target language is the native language spoken.
Mm,
Mm,
But people still believe that translating texts from one language to another
yeah.
will allow you to learn a foreign or a second language. So
interesting.
what I wanted to do my research on, which was it's already established, they've been doing research on this since like 1986, is how teaching language students and hopefully beginning language students, you want to get in there early, right? Teaching them what the science says about language
Mm,
acquisition. How does that help them persist through this really challenging task? It's hard learning a second or a foreign language.
yeah.
Can we intervene and kind of help set their expectations for what that process is going to look like through teaching them about what the science says about it?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so I almost see what you're doing here with this kind of research as potentially doing something like that for folks both in the field and looking to come into the field.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
We could get very meta and like do research
Totally.
on the impact of our research.
Let's do it.
That
I
is a valid
support
field
it.
of study.
We'll look
Yep.
to you, Kristen, to like lead that in the
Yeah.
developer experience realm. Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, if anybody listening to this or watching this YouTube video wants to fund it, you know where to find us. We're on LinkedIn.
There you go. LinkedIn is literally the worst place to find me. Find me on Blue Skies. So, oh, thank you both for this time. We'll
Yeah,
call it
thanks.
there, shall we?
Fun.
Yeah.
So fun.